64% of people who choose not to disclose being neurodivergent at work say it's because they've already been bullied. The stigma or discrimination plays a role for someone wanting to disclose. So it's no wonder so many leaders freeze before they've even said a word, worried they're going to get their language wrong or ask the wrong thing. But what if you didn't need to know anyone's diagnosis at all? Today I'm talking with Mariane Powers, behavioural scientist and former clinical psychologist, who focuses on neuroinclusive teams. Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently, and Thriving Teams, When Teams Unite, Align and Achieve. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently. I interview thought leaders from across the globe. I hope you enjoy the podcast. I'm getting more and more questions when working with teams about neurodiversity. People making assumptions about others and not sure how to discuss this within their teams. Mariane Power is a behavioural scientist and former clinical psychologist working at the intersection of neurodiversity and leadership. She helps ambitious leaders uncover, develop and protect the competitive intelligence in the minds most systems overlook. Her argument is that most organisations are trying to solve tomorrow's challenges with systems designed for yesterday's humans. Her work spans neurodivergent founders and executives, corporate and government teams, and elite sports, including teams across Goldman Sachs, APAC, Macquarie Group, Microsoft, and the Australian Institute of Sport. Mariane is the creator of Master Your Magic and host of the Jagged Brilliance series, which tells the stories of success at the edges that rarely get told. Welcome, Mariane, to the Thriving Leaders podcast.
Thanks for having me, Claire. That is quite the introduction. It's lovely to hear it back, actually.
So let's start with your story. For people who might be new to your work, how do you describe what you do and why it matters?
Oh, I have to start by saying for an ADHDer, that is the ultimate question. Those of you in the audience who are also ADHD might relate because I've done all the things and continue to do all the things. These days, I tend to find myself hanging out mostly with neurodivergent leaders, founders, creatives, people who really think outside of the edges. As you described in the intro, I'm a former clinical psychologist and I've got a further background in the arts, actually. And I laugh now because I think back to those early career days and I really do wonder if part of me trying to figure out how to human was putting all the different masks on the stage. So today I bring all of those skills together. I like to think of myself as a science communicator, really translating what can be quite confusing at times from complex human behavior into practical evidence-based strategies that people can pick up and move with to create more inclusive, kind, and at the end of the day, effective teams. Whether that's a team of themselves, I, myself, and I, for the entrepreneurs that I'm working with, the founders, or obviously, teams that are working in workplaces, communities, and sporting associations as well.
Awesome. Oh, such a diverse background for going from the arts as well to the clinical space and now working with corporates and different organisations. So I feel like this is a hot topic at the moment. Everyone, the teams that I'm working with, it's coming up a lot and some teams feel comfortable having discussions, others don't. What do you think are some of the assumptions about the work in the neurodivergent space that you find yourself correcting people about the most often?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first came into this work, and I should probably preface this by saying that I've had a bit of an interesting experience in the neurodivergent community myself because I didn't originally identify as being within the community. My own diagnosis came quite late. So I was one of those COVID ADHD late diagnosed women when everything fell apart and all of a sudden the structures and the scaffolding I'd built for myself didn't work anymore. And as you do when you go through the diagnostic process, you're peeling back all the layers and having these radical aha moments of, wow, that's the reason why I saw the world the way that I did. And I've also raised two neurodivergent kiddos. Now, actually, our entire family is neurodivergent. So I've always sort of felt like I lived up until recently as a bit of a translator between worlds. When we're talking about neurodivergence, we're talking about members of the community who identify with different neurotypes like autism, like ADHD, OCD, dyslexia. There's many more people coming into that neurodivergent community. But then we're also talking about, neurodiversity as a whole, which applies to all of us. And I think that oftentimes that's where a lot of the confusion lies. So going back to when I first came into the works 5-6 years ago now, and having these conversations with teams, the focus was really a lot on language and trying to understand, well, if we're talking about neurodiversity, who are we actually talking about? And I would say that concern or part of the conversation still exists, but I'm noticing people are moving more and more and more towards recognizing that actually when we're creating for neurodivergent people who are really the spiky, edgy ends of our community who do have some more specific needs in order to do their best and be their best at work, we're creating the conditions that work for all, which is really at the heart of the neurodiversity paradigm. So today, I would say more so the assumptions are largely around the idea that when we're talking about neurodiversity at work, that perhaps we might be considering a diversity, equity, inclusion agenda, or that maybe we're talking about recruitment and onboarding processes, wanting to pull more neurodivergent people into the workforce because of the underrepresentation that we've known for years. But that's really only a really small part of the work to be done in terms of creating neuroinclusive organizations. Because a neuroinclusive organization really recognizes that if we take neurodiversity in its most literal fashion and recognize that actually our entire ecosystem of humans is made up of lots of different neurotypes, whether you are neurodivergent and identify with something like autism, ADHD, and or if you're forming into more of what we'd say neurotypical or neuronormative ways, we all need different ways of working. So many of the organizations I'm working with are kind of on that level of change and recognizing that, yes, there's work to be done in terms of ensuring that more representation comes into the workforce, that we do address the underemployment, undereducation that we have within the neurodivergent community, but then also that actually representation is across our organizations and our communities, that we've got neurodivergent leaders, that we've got founders that are making incredible innovations today, that these different neurotypes don't just sit in any one category of representation. So that for me is really exciting because I think we're at the cusp and the forefront of starting to recognize that neurotypes have absolutely got real vulnerabilities. I know we're going to speak to some of those today. We've also got extraordinary strengths. And I guess it's what I'm really passionate about sharing is what does the full continuum and expression of neurodivergence and neurodiversity look like across all layers of our ecosystem, rather than more of that sort of, I guess, pathological or deficit-based model that we've grown up with, that the neurodiversity paradigm is really working to shift.
Yeah. It's an interesting one because I do feel like statistically, like if we think about having a fair representation in the workplace, there's already so many people who are neurodivergent in the workplace as well. And I feel like it's something that is a new topic to start talking about when it's something that's more visible, say gender or other diversity areas that are more visible. It feels easier or more binary to have a conversation about that. So why do you think some leaders are finding it more challenging right now to have conversations about neurodiversity with teams, within teams?
Well, I think you've just raised a really valid point. The neurodiversity paradigm and movement within itself is still relatively young. I think Judy Singer is often coined as being the first to have brought the term forward, although there were others who have also written about neurodiversity and the neurodivergent experience and sort of started this movement of wanting to move beyond that pathological lens, that medical model, and towards recognizing neurodiversity as like biodiversity, that there's lots of different representation. But we're not the only minority group, if you like, to have had this experience of wanting to bring our experience and our perspectives to the forefront and to be driving inclusion. We can learn a lot actually from the different movements that we've had that used to be binary. When you think about it, like that gender movement, it was binary, it was male or female. And there's been a lot of work done to understand all the different types of expressions and representations and experiences, perspectives of gender. Same with the racial movement. So we have a lot of changing language that happens within any of our minority communities. I sort of see neurodiversity as being, in some ways, while there's huge amounts of work, you can stand on the shoulders of incredible giants that are working around us and before us. But it really is a language and a conversation that's coming front and forward more so now. I think people are finding their voice, and people who are, for whatever reason, in more of a position of privilege where they feel that the vulnerability isn't there to be able to disclose difference, having a lot to do with bringing the expression of the variance of stories to the forefront. So I can understand from a workplace perspective, this is another conversation to be having. If you think back, it's not that long ago, within 100 years where industrial revolution, work was that you went to work and you went home. There wasn't this idea of culture. There wasn't this idea of looking after people. And if there was, you sort of just did it. You didn't necessarily talk about it. Whereas now, at least in Australia, we've got legislation that mandates that we look after our people. Psychosocial safety is recognised not only as the right thing to do, but the important and legal thing to do. And so when we start to understand, okay, well, if we're looking after our people and we're wanting to create safe workplaces, one, so that they can go home to their families and be productive, but also so that we can actually increase that productivity and performance, because we know that looking after people means that we're increasing our performance also. Then we start to go, okay, well, how many different ways does that show up? And neurodiversity is one of them. So I think if for anybody listening who's feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the neurodiversity movement at the moment, fair enough, I would say, is there's not a day that goes past where I'm not reading a new paper with a different perspective. So I see that as opportunity. It's exciting. It's something that we're at the forefront. We're unpacking a totally new paradigm of perspectives that with it brings a recognition of real vulnerability and the need and the responsibility, and also, I would argue, the benefits of looking after our people. But it also then opens up a whole new category of strengths and of really amplifying voices that for a long time, because of the way we've socially constructed our worldviews, our cultural norms, our workplace norms, those voices haven't been heard. I think now more than ever, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of heat, a lot of angst around, what's AI doing? Is it coming to change the workforce? How do we adapt so quickly? I'm hearing a lot about adaptability, agility in the workforce. I can tell you that the statistics are sharing that the neurodivergent population are the first ones to get in and understand that change, because like many minority groups, we've spent an entire lifetime navigating, trying to figure out what's this new thing that everybody else got the rule book on that we didn't. So for me, it's about recognizing, yes, this is new-ish. Yes, it's a new conversation coming to the forefront. And so like with anything new, what we want to be doing is adopting that lens of curiosity, of really leaning into conversations with courage and compassion, and of recognizing that we're probably going to fail sometimes. And that's okay. That actually in the failure points, we'll probably learn a lot about ourselves and about each other. Yeah, so I guess mine is probably a more optimistic and hope-filled vision of that confusion, if you like, because out of anything that's a little bit confusing and daunting tends to come some opportunities for something pretty cool that we haven't done before.
Yeah. I think you highlight a couple of key points around the strengths of having neurodiversity within your team, and even having worked with lots of entrepreneurial leaders as well, like often whether they're self-diagnosed or actually diagnosed, they'll talk to some of their neurodivergent traits that help them take risks and do other things as well.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting is we've got neurodiversity within our family as well, and the supports that they put in place at schools, even when my son was going to do NAP plan and, they had suggested that he could get extra time. And I just thought, well, academically, he's doing fine. I don't want him to feel singled out. But a third of the year level had, were in a separate classroom because they all had some form of, whether it was neurodiversity or needed some support as well. So it's just interesting in schools, the supports that we put in place to set people up for success versus the workplace. What are your kind of thoughts hearing that?
Oh gosh, okay, this could be a rabbit hole deep dive. Something we didn't share in the intro, but those who have been following my work for a while will know that actually prior to doing a lot more in the neurodiversity, inclusion and leadership space, I ran a social enterprise called the Posify Group. And it's still bubbling away. And it really was looking at that question of education and how we're setting our kids up for success, how we teach them those future readiness skills and what it looks like to map your skills, your strengths, your sense of purpose to be able to move into this ever-evolving world. And so I'm so pleased to hear that that's your experience of the education system. I think, we were advocating for that for a very long time. And that's for any families who are a little bit probably beyond your parenting stage. That's a win, because there's certainly been a stage in a season not so long ago where education was really struggling to understand the need for those individual learning differences. And there's been a lot of work done. So that's a beautiful example for workplaces of just how quickly things can change when we start to recognize that actually, yes, we can look at a label and say, okay, this person needs that accommodation for this reason. You mentioned having some extra time, which is really helpful for people who have brains like mine that can potentially shut down a little bit more quickly if I'm faced with what I perceive to be a stressor, just because of the way my nervous system is wired and the working memory differences that I have already. It's not that I don't have attention, it's that I've got attention that's filtered across lots of different exciting opportunities to lock in, right? So in an exam setting, that's a beautiful example. So you mentioned that, but for others, it might be that the sensory stimulation in a big room is a thing that gets in the way of their need to really lock into that executive function. For others, the variation, the lighting, for example, the sounds, whatever it might be. And so if we move beyond asking, well, what's the label that this person has in order to give them the conditions to perform at their best? And we start asking instead, what does help you to work well and what gets in the way? And how can we sort of maneuver the environment around us to be more flexible and to make sure that you do have more autonomy? They are questions that we can move from education into the workplace relatively easily and effectively if we acknowledge and appreciate the value that's behind doing that. I think probably the other objection, if you like, for want of a better word, that I hear oftentimes from leadership teams who are exploring whether or not neuroinclusion is something that they want to make a priority, which always sounds funny as it comes out of my mouth. So I just want to preface that, is the idea that somehow it's going to be absolutely impossible. That how can we possibly do that if we don't have people disclose what their label is? And how can we possibly know all the variations that every single neurotype needs? And I tend to say, I agree with you. I think that's an impossible expectation. But what you can do is apply universal design principles that look at the assumption that if we design from the outer edges and we look to, okay, what are the simple things that we can do to offer people that flexibility, that autonomy, that ability to speak up and share how they work at their best, or to advise when something's not working and putting them at risk? How can we create those environments where there is that psychological safety, recognizing that there are members of vulnerability groups and minority groups that haven't been able to have a voice? And so how can we speak up with them and really invite them into those conversations? That's where we're going to start to see, I think, the same growth that you've been observing in the education sector. And shout out to the teachers who have been doing such a job of this. I really have such respect, because there's up to 30 little people in a classroom, right? And each one of them performs completely differently, as we all do, as we're adults as well, in workplaces and community groups as well.
Yeah, I completely echo that. I've come from the generation before me were all school teachers, and I'm sure the labels were very different back then as well.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one, like hearing you talk about the conversations that leaders need to have with their teams, regardless of whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. I think it's really important, like whether it's talking about different personality styles or preferences or cultural similarities and differences. I think it's just having conversations about how we can be at our best, regardless of what the label is, and actually disclosing and sharing what you feel comfortable sharing too. So what are some of the stats around the rates of disclosure? And, why don't people choose to share anything? I guess there's labels and assumptions people make, but what's your view on that?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to that in two different ways, I guess, which is the privilege I think I bring to the conversation. And I acknowledge in that I've got my own lived experience of what that looks like. And I've sat with countless neurodivergent people across the lifespan to hear their stories as well. And then we can read the statistics. So I know people like numbers and they like papers. I'll give you a few more recent ones. And look, I know we're going to share these in the show notes as well, but I really encourage people to dive into these papers because they're so well done. They do capture largely the UK population, but at least anecdotally and from what I hear from the community, it really does translate across here to Australia as well. So the first one would be back in 23, McDowell and colleagues. And they sat down and they looked at a whole range of neurodiversity in business and what's going on. Disclosure was a really big part of that conversation. And they found that of the people who didn't disclose, 64% of those people were citing genuine bullying, stigma, and discrimination from colleagues and peers and leaders and managers. And so if you think about somebody who may have come into a late neurodivergent identification, for example. Because, by the way, when I say identification, there's a couple of different pathways that somebody will find themselves within the neurodivergent community. One, they'll have a formalized diagnosis, and that usually takes part because the wheels have fallen off the wagon and there's a form of distress, if you like, or a variation that means that their work has become really difficult or their relationships are struggling, or there's a form of suffering that tends to lead people towards a diagnosis. It's an expensive thing to do. It's a hard thing to get into, and it's a really long, drawn out process. My diagnosis took 3 GPs saying, I don't think that that's the case for you. You can't possibly be ADHD. You've finished a master's program. You can't be intelligent and have ADHD. So we're still battling against a lot of those old stigmas of what neurodivergent people even look like, right? So that's one form that somebody can find their way into the neurodivergent community. But the other is self-identification. And we know now from the research that actually, particularly the autistic community, the majority of people who self-identify as autistic first and then for whatever reason find their way into a formalized diagnosis, the odds are so stacked against them being right. Surprise, surprise. Again, nobody tends to go looking for a way to be different. It's a bit of a funny myth that exists out of the world that somebody would want to all of a sudden wake up and decide they're ADHD or autistic or dyslexic or otherwise. So we're pretty good at figuring ourselves out. It's like any other minority group. But going back to those rates of disclosure, so you imagine someone's coming into this late identification, finally going, yeah, right. So that's why I insert whatever behavior or whatever form of difference they're looking at. Do I really want to share that with somebody else? Now, if those signals of safety aren't around in the workplace, and there are actually 3 specific signals of safety, if you like, we can talk about those as well. But if they're not visibly there, then what an incredibly smart thing for a neurodivergent person to actually zip their lips and just suss the world out first. Because the majority of neurodivergent people have faced some form of othering to get to the point that they're at. And the majority of neurodivergent people, the majority of any person, doesn't want to find themselves in a situation where all of a sudden they're needing to defend themselves, explain themselves, or justify their actions. So in terms of that non-disclosure piece, it's complex. There's a lot of reasons as to why people won't disclose. What I think is interesting is the second paper I would direct the listeners to is a more recent one, actually. It's Neurodiversity in Business, the 2026 report, and also by McDowell and her colleagues. Apologies for pronunciation. I think it's Srisvinasan. And they were actually looking at this idea of disclosure and when and why people do disclose and to whom. And what I thought was interesting, I wrote the stats down so I could not misquote them, but their point being that when it comes to disclosure, people really trust people and not necessarily the systems. So they found in the 660 people that they interviewed that the higher rates of disclosure were to a colleague and or to a direct line manager, and the lower rates of disclosure, significant, statistically, I should say, significant, were to HR. Now, I find that really interesting because if I'm brought in to do neuroinclusive consulting, for example, with an organization, it tends to come one of 2 ways. It's either from the grassroots, where you've got like an employee representative group who's wanting to put on some form of awareness campaign to support the grassroots work that they're doing, and or it's an HR leader who's looking at many of their policies and procedures and saying, oh, we're missing this part. But the assumption tends to be that the question is, how do we create the conditions so that people will go to HR? I like to flip that question and say, how do we create the conditions so that people can talk to anybody and feel safe and seen and heard, and so that anybody that they talk to feels empowered and, importantly, equipped to be able to direct that person to the right avenue to get the support that they need, if it's support, or to get the validation or the visibility or the sense of belonging that they're looking for. So I really think that in terms of disclosure, if that's what's on your agenda, I would argue it's not necessary in order to create a neuro-inclusive community. But that to the side. If disclosure is really important for you, then I think we really need to be looking at the safety in our organizations and dismantling the idea that there's some kind of hierarchy that comes down to who should disclose to who and what for. People's privacy is something that's worth respecting. And if somebody does disclose any layer of their personal life, and or their work life and or what's going on in their head. That's a piece of treasure and gold that I'd like to see held with that level of gratitude, for want of a better word, admiration, excitement, like all of the beautiful, beautiful joy pieces. Yeah, and I'm not sure that we're there yet at the collective. It's still seeming, from the leaders I speak to, from the people on the grounds, and my own experience walking into communities, it's still seeing a little bit of a tick a box exercise on the large part. Not to say people aren't doing things differently, but we've still got some work to go.
Yeah. So I'm hearing psychological safety is foundational to be able to, for people to feel comfortable to share whatever it is they choose to share. And even if I reflect on the example I gave of my son, my reaction was I didn't want him to feel different, but then I was like, oh, well, you're actually not that different if there's a third of people. So then if you translate that into the workplace with people that you're working with every day, there's a choice in that as well. And if it doesn't feel safe to do so, I can understand why people might hold back or withhold that information. So you mentioned 3 signals. What are the 3 signals that you mentioned before?
Yeah, I want to go to those 3 signals, but you just mentioned something, if I could double click on it quickly, because I think multiple things can be true at the same time. That is one of the features of my own neurodivergence, if you like. I like to hold multiple things.
Yeah.
But on difference, we are different.
Yeah.
And we know that. If we're different in the sense that there is a set of rules that, for whatever reason, because of our wiring, our nervous systems, our brains, we didn't get about how to fit in, how to rock up, and how to be seen to be alike, if you like. So we are different, which doesn't mean that we can't find ways to shape and mold and slide our way into circumstances. But oftentimes there is a real tax on that. As many of the leaders I work with and kiddos, I used to spend a lot of time in adolescent and family work particularly when I was practicing as a clinical psychologist. A lot of the work was actually in holding those 2 things side by side and recognizing the difference and in really celebrating that, as opposed to saying, oh, actually, I'm not that different because there are others like me. Those 2 things can coexist. There are others like us. Of course, that's how we have a neurodivergent community. And there are others who don't understand us. I don't know if your listeners have maybe come across the concept of the double empathy problem. It's a really great one to look into, because for a very long time, the assumption was that we had at least forms of treatment and modality, and that's using those air quotes for anyone just listening, where the idea was that we needed to support neurodivergent people and treat them to learn how to be more neurotypical. So we had, behavioural strategies that taught them to be more neurotypical. What that really only did was enforce masking, which we know to be really not beneficial. But when we stopped asking, okay, well, if this is potentially a non-pathological problem and maybe this is a form of human variation, and we started looking at, well, how does communication show up when, for example, autistic people and autistic people communicate with one another? Is there any problem there? Turns out there's not. Actually, autistic and autistic people communicating oftentimes do that incredibly well together. Autistic and allistic or non-autistic people, put those 2 in the room, you've got a translation problem. So the question becomes, why has the emphasis always been on the autistic person needing to adapt to the autistic or non-autistic person? And where is the opportunity for the autistic or non-autistic person to learn how to adapt, to work with the difference of the autistic person? So I think we do ourselves a disservice by skipping over the difference. I'd like to see us leaning in to difference and recognizing that difference is really important, actually, for our evolution, for our survival, for our thriving as a human species, in the same way that difference in our natural environment from a biodiversity perspective, we only had one form of tree, that would be a bit of a problem, as it would be with all the insects and the birds and the beautiful things that come to light. So yeah, I hope that's okay that I double clicked on that piece.
Yeah. And I'll just pick up on that, because when I wrote Thriving Teams, there was a piece of research that Deakin University did last year in 2025 about teams that just focus on difference can drive themselves further apart. And it's about we need to focus on difference and we need to focus on similarities. And that's actually what brings us closer together.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like the way I look at that, whether that's to do with personality styles, whether it's to do with whatever the difference or similarity is, it's really about just having conversations about when we're at our best, when we're not at our best, what that looks like, what we need from each other and having those conversations to normalize the needs of everyone within the team, regardless of, you know, what that difference is, but having actual conversations, which goes to the point about the strengths. How do we actually highlight our strengths to each other and share the strengths, and how you can leverage the strengths of everyone in the team? And I think sometimes people, when they just focus on difference, it can drive us further apart. So it's how do you have the end conversation?
I'm so glad you said that. That's where I wanted to double click on. It's the and conversation. I think
Yeah.
there's been a little bit of a rush in wanting to adopt the neurodiversity paradigm to speak about how neurodivergent people show up with their superpowers, which unfortunately can come across as being quite ableist because we're not yet recognizing that at the top of our conversation, we were talking about how neurodiversity is just a new conversation where everyone's going, what's this thing? Right?
Yeah.
So we need to have all sides of the conversation. And I also hear your point that there can be that hyper focus on the differences and the deficits and the struggles and the vulnerabilities. When we recognize that we're holding a community of people who have for so long not been heard, we can probably have a little bit more compassion as to why there might need to be a little bit more scaffolding between, yes, there's differences and vulnerabilities, and then how do we look at strengths? And like we would in any positive psychology intervention, which is largely my background and my area of research, is how can we adopt a solutions-oriented and strengths-focused conversation to be able to recognize and truly honor any of those vulnerabilities of being different, and to actually want to get to know what that's like as well. Because there is strength and there is possibility and perspective in difference. And then how can we sit that alongside a strength, recognizing that in order to activate that strength, we really need to make sure that we've optimized the conditions that set people up for success. Yeah, so there's nuance, and it takes people like you, Claire, to be able to hold those conversations with the consideration and the capacity to recognize the full spectrum of the human experience. So yeah, I really love the work you're doing for that reason. But you asked me about the 3 conditions.
Before we go to the 3 signals, and look at us going down our rabbit hole.
I know, right?
But, you know, I just thought I'd share an example because I've been working with a leadership team, and when we had our one-on-one catch-ups before we all got together, there was some dysfunction that needed to be worked through, but a lot of people were self-diagnosing other people within the team, and it was quite interesting. And when we actually got together after a few sessions, people had shared a lot about themselves in terms of their needs and their strengths and their personality and all that sort of stuff. But we never actually talked about neurodivergence because it wasn't required. And that was a choice for people if they wanted to disclose or not, and they chose not to. But it was a lot of assumptions that are being made about other people. And I think that's often coming up more and more. And that was the reason why I wanted to have the conversation with you, because I think we can still have these conversations without necessarily labeling people.
Yeah, 100%. It's interesting. I just finished up some work with Paddle Australia and working with their coaches. A lot of the athletes, especially the elite athletes, have either a formal or an informal diagnosis or identification of a neurodivergence. And it was interesting to hear that very debate play out within the team. And obviously I've got their consent to share this story. But the idea of why do we need to have labels? Why are labels important? And again, this is one of those debates where people are going to have very strong opinions. For some, and this is captured really well in the literature, I'll share the paper with you as well if you like. For those who have come into that late diagnosis or late identification, the relief and or the shedding of the shame that they realize actually wasn't theirs to carry, that they've now got another name for a label that they otherwise would have been assigned as weird, as too much, as too sensitive, and that now they can place it and give someone a language that says, oh, actually, I'm ADHD, or actually, I'm autistic. There is some power in the label and the language, and I don't want to take that away for people where there is that power. And to your point, I think when we're working in teams, I'd like to see a future where we start to say, you know what, I'm the kind of person who really benefits from having an agenda ahead of schedule so that I can just mentally prepare and see myself in that room. Or I'm the kind of person, if you're going to plan a big night out, I really want to join you, but could you just send me a little bit of a social map of where I'm going and what's ahead of me? Because I find it easier to get there if I can visually see what's happening. So if we can start to name the features of our neurotypes. I'm very passionate about knowing your neurotype, knowing the brain behind your business if you're a founder and entrepreneur. Because when you understand your nervous system and its own unique, quirks, for want of a better word, and differences and ways of showing up, understand the vulnerability stack, and you understand the strengths, then you can scaffold your environment and communicate it to others in a way where you can work at your best. So I think I think we're very aligned in that. And I hope that more leaders, as they're listening to this conversation, will start to get curious with one another. Yeah. And ask about those differences. And to your point, to find that shared humanity in experience as well.
Yeah, definitely. So let's get to these 3 signals that we were talking about before.
Yeah, we've worked them up, haven't we? Yeah. And again, I was happy to share the paper, but it was really interesting. This research, back in 2022, I should say, by Brower and colleagues, came out and showed that there are actually specific conditions or climates, they called, for psychological safety amongst neurodivergent people. And look, they've got all sorts of interesting psychobabble jargon terms. It's a cruel thing to say, but for layman's terms, I like just to explain it as you've got visibility, you've got belonging, and then you've got a sense of justice and or ethics, right? And there's technical terms for those, but it's that perceived climate of, can I see other people around me? So perceived diversity. Can I actually, if I'm a neurodivergent person, so if I'm an ADHD person, when I walk into the organization, can I see other people like me? Now, some of that, like any kind of group, we're actually pretty good at sniffing each other out. So we tend to spot, to your point, some of those commonalities and go, oh, yeah, okay, yep, I see that. Also, if it's named, for example, I put the signature of she, her, my pronouns, and then ADHD at the bottom of my email. I know others who put their pronouns and then dyslexic at the bottom. So if that type of visibility is there in the culture, then that is tick number 1. Tick number 2 is then, is there a place for belonging? So is there that perceived, like, we can not only see each other, but actually we've got ways to be able to communicate and express our differences. So for me, that's things like, yes, your big awareness days. But I have to say, if you're hosting just a neurodiversity or neuroinclusion awareness day and you're not following it up with the other conditions for psychosocial safety, you're potentially doing yourself a disservice, because our community is very good at sniffing out incongruence. So the values metrics on the wall, that's not going to go down, especially for the autistic community. But your sense of justice is a real strength in our community, as is a consistency in things kind of making sense. And so that idea of belonging is, okay, are we invited as a community to be able to contribute to changing policies, to be able to join meetings, to have different variations of perhaps the cultural meetup and groups? There's a lot of neurodivergent people, and I would say people that don't necessarily, maybe they're introverts or for whatever reason, don't always love the big hoo-hurrah trivia campaign, let's get together, culture club events on a Friday. Others, sensory seekers, adore it. And so that piece of belonging is recognizing that actually we all celebrate togetherness and belonging in different ways. And so how is that communicated and invited in amongst the organization? And the third piece, that piece around the equity piece, that justice climate, comes down to the policies and procedures. And ironically, when I'm often asked to come into an organization, that's where I'm asked to start. Unfortunately, if you've just got a policy and a procedure that lives in a drawer and doesn't actually live in the fabric of the culture of your people, it's a no from me. We're not going to be a good working group, because it's so important to me that the integrity of what's on that piece of paper lives in the heartbeat of the humans in your organization. That said, the policies and the procedures are absolutely pivotal. And I'll give you a really good example why. I worked with a leader recently who had just moved up in terms of her hierarchy, if you like. She'd been associate and she'd moved into a director role. And she was looking after some new employees that came into the team. And within that engagement, she uncovered that there were some, let's just say, less appealing behaviors that were happening in terms of those interpersonal dynamics. Anybody who was all over psychosocial safety would immediately say, this is a red flag and it's got some form of reporting and recording responsibility. But in moving into her position, she hadn't been given any formal onboarding to understand what the policies and procedures were for her as a leader to hold that level of disclosure from a new employee about another employee's behavior that should have been reported. There actually wasn't even the policy and the procedure. There was, however, a culture that said, we really care about our people. We're showing all the reasons why. We're doing the get-togethers. We're doing the well-being sessions. So all of the intention was there, but the ability to execute with a very explicit and clear communication pipeline as to how that happened wasn't. So while I say, that third condition of climate of the policies and the procedures, I don't like to see people starting there.
Mm.
Ideally, you put the 3 stacks along. But if you're going to start somewhere, first of all, start with the people who need to be writing the policies and procedures with you. There's a great saying in the autistic community, it started, it's kind of rippled out the neurodivergent community broadly, which is nothing about us without us. So consult your people, bring people in. And if you don't have the safety and the culture where people are putting their hands up and recognizing their representation, then I think that's where an external provider who can come in and bring both that lived experience and the clinical insights to the ballgame to help you get started across each of those 3 pillars is really great foundational point for psychosocial safety, specific to that neuro-inclusive climate.
Yeah. So you're talking about like the visibility, belonging, but also creating fairness within the climate, whether that's through policies and structures. When a guest that previously came on the Thriving Leaders podcast who I interviewed for my book was Greg Pickering, who the topic wasn't actually to do with neurodiversity, but he shared he works at AFCA and we were talking about accountability, but he actually shared some of the great things that at the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, which is AFCA, were doing in terms of best practice around, neuro inclusion. What have you observed? Like who's doing it really well, or what, if we were going to be a really great or inclusive leader, like what are the things that we should be focusing on? Do you have any stories or examples to share?
Oh, and look, this is where I do consider myself very lucky because as you can imagine, if somebody calls Maz, they're kind of at that change point where they're recognizing this is worth having, right?
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories, and I didn't work intensively with them, but I worked alongside them, was actually with the Ronald McDonald House, a charity down in Foster, so northern New South Wales here. And I did some work with them for their charity fundraising. And what I think that they have done beautifully and brilliantly for the families that come in to their respite care is recognize the importance of neuro inclusion from that sensory and that environmental perspective. So without needing to sort of send out the accommodations requests, and which, by the way, I'm all for accommodations requests, so I shouldn't say that they're not important, but they almost weren't even necessary in this case because the way that they've set up the actual retreat for families is so inclusive by design. And I think that when I think of all the different organizations that I've worked with, from small startup founders with teams of 3 who are considering how do we factor in that some people, because of their chronotype, are up late at night and others are early in the morning. Others, for example, in our neurodivergent community are caring for neurodivergent kiddos who have got really extensive needs, and that's their other full-time job. It goes across the board, but this setup at this retreat was just stunning. They had quiet spaces for the families. They had all sorts of textures and layers for people to be able to choose. They had boxes so that if you're a sensory seeking family, you could pull out all the things, the fidget toys, the spinners, all the jazz. But if you're somebody who's a bit more sensory avoidant, then they had the dimmers on the lights that you could turn down and the boxes where the things could go away and you could have a very calm, uncluttered place. They'd set the retreat and maximize the exposure to nature because we know that from a neuro-inclusive perspective, all of the, I guess, more industrial built layers of our landscape can be quite jarring for us. They'd really used natural earthing timbers, had access to all of the different modalities, again, for the different neurotypes in mind. I just thought that was such a stunning example of universal design in action, which if your listeners haven't heard of universal design, I really encourage you to go and have a look. There's sort of 7 different principles to be thinking about. And again, it's that idea of rather than designing our environments and the way that we approach our communication, our sense of belonging, all of the conditions of safety across environmental access as well, that we're, instead of thinking of that normal way or the societal sort of dominant way of being, we really want to consider the edges and ask questions like, well, who might we be accidentally leaving out here and how could we bring them in? So yeah, that was a really standout example for me of somebody doing universal design and neuro-inclusive design very, very well.
Yeah. Awesome. What a great example. So if you're a leader wanting to be more neuro-inclusive, what are some tips that you have for a leader?
Oh, remembering again that if you're a leader wanting to be neuro-inclusive, you may need to be self-leading because you may be neurodivergent yourself. And you also may be leading neurodiverse teams, which means within that team, you've got neurotypicals and neurodivergent people, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's curiosity. It's a beginner's mindset. It's recognizing that many of the old assumptions that we have run our workplaces and communities by are being turned upside down. And I think that's true for all of us right now with AI coming through the mix and really challenging our idea of what success looks like anyway. But it's particularly true for minority groups who have experienced othering throughout their life. And so asking questions, being okay with failing as well. I think there's a lot of justified angst, if you like, around, did I say the right things? What's the definition? And that the great starting place is to familiarize yourself with the language, because language does matter. It shows that you care apart from anything. But recognizing that, one person in front of you is going to have a different interpretation of language to the other person. And so being okay with saying, my intention here was XYZ, but I want to check in with you. How did that land? And what could I do differently? Also recognizing that people have their own space and level of comfort in terms of processing and integrating new information. And so they might not be able to give you a response on the spot, but that's okay. I always talked about raising our kids, and when I work with families, about this concept of putting tokens in the trust bucket and not expecting anything in return, right? So you hope that when you're putting the tokens in, that over time, you're going to be the person that can be the safe person that they come back to, especially if you're a parent. But you're not expecting that every single token that gets put in shows you in return that outcome that you think you're going in with. So sort of letting go of those preconceived ideas that input A equals output a relationship, whatever, and recognizing that trust with anybody takes time, and particularly with members of your teams or of your families, of your community who have had experiences where perhaps for whatever reason, their voices might not have been heard as loudly as they'd like them to. So curiosity, beginner's mindset, patience, and trust.
Yeah.
Being a good human, really.
Being a good person, really, isn't it? So there's a bit of an assumption that neuroinclusion, there's a neurotypical leader managing a neurodivergent team, but often it's the leader that's neurodivergent as well. And you do a lot of work with neurodivergent leaders. What are the things that you're seeing in that space?
Yeah, the neurodivergent leadership thing is such a passion of mine. And partly selfishly, I shared before that I came into this space with my own late diagnosis, but also because I'd spent my entire career looking at, although I was trained in clinical psychology, looking at the idea of functioning to flourishing. What are the transcendent emotional states, and how do we activate peak performance and sustainable well-being over time? And when I went looking for that with my new understanding of my neurotype, I couldn't find much. And so that's what I'm noticing with the neurodivergent leaders. Many of them are coming into their identification, not necessarily because something went wrong per se, and or they fell into that sort of more pathological experience or that vulnerability stack where their neurotype became a form of disability, if we think about that social disability metric. Some of them do definitely come in via burnout. And so learning to understand the specific vulnerability stack that sits against their nervous system differences, their executive function differences, whatever might be going on in terms of their health stack. But actually, many of them have come into identification through that functioning to flourishing space of recognizing a gap between their perceived potential and their actual performance. And that was partly the case for myself as well. And so when you notice that gap and you can feel that there's something that could be, or other people are noticing, oftentimes I'll hear from neurodivergent leaders that they're often told as a kid, oh, Mary would be fantastic only if she XYZ. And the only if she tends to be the vulnerability or the difference that happens in your working memory, your executive function, your sensitive nervous system, right? And so when there all of a sudden is this recognition, to your point, we've studied personalities, we've studied strengths, we've studied all these different ways of being in the world. When you recognize that actually identifying with a neurotype doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be unwell or unfit for work, but it could mean that you could be doing things differently, that starts to open up a whole new landscape of what I like to say is sort of that neuro-adjusted peak performance protocol that recognizes that the way we need to set our work-life design up is different to those who are born with that more sort of neurotypical or neuronormative way of being in the world, who also might find some of the inconveniences in today's modern workplace, but who can, generally speaking, kind of fit that mold. Neurodivergent leaders, by the time I'm working with them, tend to have had a long history of masking, of camouflaging, of hitting those sort of sprint and then bust or burn cycles that just get fed up with. So it's about reauthoring the identity around, who am I? What are some of those layers of shame that I can actually just let go of and shed? But also getting really real and practical about the reality, which is that being a neurodivergent leader does come with a set of really unique challenges and opportunities. So I think the more leaders that step up and step into naming and claiming, celebrating and sharing their unique ways of leading in the world, the better and more diverse our leadership profile globally is going to be, in the same way we've seen that across every minority group. I'm really excited for our neurodivergent leaders. I think we're only just getting started, so watch this space. We're about to jump on the stage and, well, maybe not floodlights for all, because that might not be so sensory friendly. But let's just say we've got some stories to share.
Yeah, definitely. So the question I've got now is an interesting one because it actually came up in the last week with a leader that I was talking to about how they felt that neurodiversity is almost being weaponized in the workplace. So people are using it as a bit of an excuse. And the example that they gave was they'd given some feedback in a style that they thought suited their personality style. And the person said, I can't take this feedback on board because of my neurodivergence, and really pushed back on being open to the feedback. And it was almost like an excuse. And then it was about the person, how they gave the feedback was the feedback rather than the actual feedback itself. So what do you suggest when people are weaponizing or using it as a excuse or get out of jail free card? And when that happens, what do you suggest for a leader or a team member when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I'd hate to speak specifically to that case because I don't know it and I'm not familiar with it.
Right.
But more broadly speaking, I could say a couple of things that come to mind. Firstly, again, if we consider that this person may have only recently come into understanding their neurotype, that is a possibility. And if that was the case, they might also be walking through practicing out loud self-advocacy for the first time.
Yeah.
And so different people have had different exposure to levels of education, of understanding of what their rights are. And this is where, those policies and practices that we spoke about earlier, that's why it's so important, so that people do understand what is the responsibility of the individual and what is the responsibility of the organization. And then how do we meet in the middle? So the more open you can be and explicit that you can be in demonstrating and giving really explicit examples of what that looks like in the culture, and the more that you can show those times where you didn't have the explicit policy or practice or whatever it is outlined, but that you work together and that that's something that gets celebrated and talked about, that the failure is recognized as much as the accomplishment of the success, that's where people then bring that new layer of self-advocacy to the forefront in a way that can be safe. On the idea of, can it be weaponized? Unfortunately, for lots of different reasons, there are always going to be people in any type of group setting who, for whatever reason, feel that they want to or need to play a vulnerability stack to be able to avoid something that is uncomfortable or something that isn't working out in the way that they want it to. I've certainly seen on a few different occasions where I've been brought in for perhaps mediation, for example, within an organization where there's one team member who's working really hard to be accommodating and to be supportive, and in some cases who's probably over rescuing more than they possibly need to. And the other party is finding all sorts of different reasons to pull out labels, to pull out rationale. And so that, for me, that becomes a conversation around accountability. So again, multiple things could be true. There can oftentimes be ways that the organization can flex to meet the needs of the employee. My dad used to always say to us, and still does, you got to go halfway. And so if the employee, for whatever reason, isn't able to flex, then that's a different conversation around what is getting in the way. Because if a label or any kind of difference means that you can't do the job that you could do for whatever reason a period of time ago, then there needs to be a reevaluation of the job role and whether or not there is a fit for purpose for the benefit of the person who's in distress as well, right? Like nobody wants to be, I wouldn't have thought, in a position where they're not feeling like they can be at their best. So those cases, I actually think they get a lot of the limelight and they get a lot of the attention because they tend to be the loud, squeaky wheels. But when we look at that alongside then the rates of non-disclosure and the recognition that actually many neurodivergent people are working really hard to get themselves into positions that they're wanting to be in, but can't necessarily find the doors to open or the pathways to get there. I think we need to be able to hold those things side by side. Oftentimes there's a lot more going on for somebody than just their label as to why they would use that label to sort of divert or defer the piece of accountability that they're being asked to step into. They're complex cases.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even just having conversations about, well, how do you like to receive feedback? Or if there is an avoidance, calling out that pattern so that you can actually work through it, because there's multiple things that could be going on there. So if you could leave our listeners with one message about thriving teams, what would that be?
Oh, again, one, to an ADHD brain. Get excited. Get excited. This is a period of time we're all moving through such rapid change. There's not a LinkedIn post or an article or a feature that I don't read that's not speaking to the pace of accelerated change across all aspects. We've talked today about neurodiversity, but all aspects of life. And we can look at that through a couple of different lenses, one being fear. Humans don't tend to like change overall. We tend to like security and safety. But we can also say, okay, well, if we're wanting that security and safety, this is a real opportunity to step into exploration, to innovation, to possibility. So for me, creating thriving teams is really looking at those opportunities and recognizing that I haven't yet met a culture that doesn't have ambassadors within it who have got just that glint in their eye and that lean towards optimism and towards possibility, who can't actually carry the torch for those around them. So I would say find those people and do everything that you can to equip them with everything that they need to bring your people along with them. Because I think we're moving into an abundant era if we choose to. There's a lot of change that's going to bring distress and discomfort and challenge along the way. But we've done hard things before and we'll do them again. And the language of thriving and flourishing happens across the entire human spectrum. So lean into difference. And look for those people with the glint in their eye.
Love it. Thank you so much for coming on the Thriving Leaders podcast. I've really loved the conversation and we'll definitely share all that great research in the show notes too. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Claire. And likewise, love to all your listeners.
Awesome. I love this conversation. Mariane got us to reframe that you don't need a label to build an inclusive team. You just need to ask, what helps you do your best work and what gets in the way? Her 3 signals of neuroinclusion are around visibility, belonging, and a genuine sense of justice. This really gives leaders something concrete to check in on rather than a vague sense of what they should be doing better. I particularly like the story about Ronald McDonald Retreat, which brought universal design principles to life for me. Inclusion built into the space itself, so nobody has to ask for it. What I really appreciated was Mariane holding the nuances, differences and similarity, flexibility and accountability. A label that can be a relief for one person and completely unnecessary for the next. Leading well here isn't about getting the label right. It's about creating the conditions for your teams to do their best work. Please share this with a leader who's navigating the same questions and follow the show and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, facilitation, keynote speaking, or executive or team coaching, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful tips on leadership and team development, as well as our podcast. You can also grab a copy of either of my books on our website, and it's also available on all good online retailers, including Audible, Spotify, and Kindle. If you like this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive. Please subscribe.